I'm Lake. I'm from Lake Partners. I'll be today's moderator for this session of the Greenwich Roundtable, which is a series of seminars sponsored by Jeffries & Company. I want to thank Steve McMenamin for all of his help in organizing this event. Our topic today is the promise of the 21st century, and our speaker is Michael Milken, chairman of Knowledge Universe. I suspect most of you have probably heard of Michael Milken. You may not have heard, though, of his cookbook, which he published last year, called The Taste for Living, which is Mike Milken's favorite recipes for fighting cancer. And I have seen the book. I thought it was a very interesting title. It's probably the most delicious double meaning of a book that I've come across in quite a while. And if Michael Milken ever writes an autobiography, it probably should be called not Taste for Living, but Voracious Appetite for Living. Most of us run on two legs. He seems to run on four. The four legs being Knowledge Universe, CapCure, Milken Family Foundation, and Milken Institute. Just very briefly, Knowledge Universe is a family of companies providing lifelong learning opportunities and meeting the knowledge needs of individuals and companies. CapCure, Mike launched as an effort to fast-track medical research to fight cancer. The Milken Family Foundation, which she founded in '82, has been built into one of the largest private foundations in the U.S. And the Milken Institute, which Mike is chairman of, has brought together respected economists, demographers, and social scientists to study economic growth, job formation, and access to financial capital. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Mike Milken.
Thank you. Good morning. We are provided you a handout, so all of you who read those presentations by companies can go to the end before I even begin, which will give you a chance for your questions. And I thought what I would do today is try to see if we could take a peek at the future and before it occurs, going out maybe 20 or 30 years, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions you want. And to begin with that, I think my goal here was to try to create a frame of reference in order to look at the future. And one of the presentations I would make, or one of the arguments or hypotheses I would make to you, is that most people's perception of what is occurring is incorrect, and it comes to be how we learned, how we grew up, how we were taught. And the other thing is it's very difficult to change things that people strongly believe in. And it takes a lot of creativity to do that, and sometimes you never change that, what they basically believe in a lifetime. And the best way is to let people discover it for themselves. I myself thought I knew everything by the time I was 18 years old. I was all over Los Angeles. I had traveled around the country, and I had chosen to go to college at Berkeley, which allows you to see the whole world just from walking on campus. When I arrived, the Free Love Society was a very popular organization on campus, and its table at Telegraph and Bancroft was right next to the American Nazi Party's table, right next to the American Communist Party's table, and a few other tables. So it was an interesting experience. And shortly after I arrived, it seems like wherever I go, there's always a little cloud of dust. Shortly thereafter, the free speech movement began at Berkeley. And many people's perception of what occurred was quite different than what actually occurred. There were really no students that were injured. There was no one really that was really injured. Yet friends of mine from France called because they heard all the students had been killed. By the time they had moved from Berkeley east across the Atlantic, what had occurred had been exaggerated, and sometimes we forget the amount of money you need to invest to bail 700 people out of jail. One of my first financing assignments only required raising $1,100. So it wasn't a major assignment that day on campus. But I put a picture here of what was Gold's in Los Angeles because Berkeley was a tremendous experience, but I had to reevaluate everything that I thought about. On August 11th, 1965, when I was back in Los Angeles, and saw the Watts riots break out in an area that I grew up in, spent a lot of time in, and I wanted to head that night down into South Central LA, and my father had a conversation with me. He told me he hoped that I had recently inherited a great deal of money, in that if I hadn't and I left the house, I wouldn't be getting any financial support next semester. And as a father today, I quite often think of my own kids that told me that they wanted to head down there. And 2 days later, I was able to get down there, and I actually met an individual who participated in burning down a building that he worked in, who had no savings and no other job. And it really caused me to rethink everything that I thought was occurring, because I did not feel any discrimination growing up in Los Angeles. It was a city of dreams. It was obviously, in my opinion, the Ellis Island of this generation, the previous generation. Some of you in New York might still think you're the Ellis Island, but it long passed, in my opinion, to California. And he was an individual who felt he was disenfranchised, and it was their company, not his company. And this is the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and my view was there was little access to capital, and if this was the feeling in Los Angeles, it was only a matter of time before it was throughout the country. As some of you might know, almost everything in the country starts in California, both good and bad. Drive-by shootings started in California, I'm sorry to tell you, but so did tax revolts and other types of things that occurred. So I went back and switched from math and science to business and began working on my little formula that you see here, which starts with PP, standing for prosperity. What is prosperity in a city, a state, a country? And began focusing on something called real assets, which most of you are involved with in the investment business. What is a real asset? And some people thought it was factories and roads and bridges and buildings. And my very first speech when I went to Wall Street in '69 was the best investor was a social scientist. A lot of people consider that okay because I was from Brooklyn. I was crazy anyway, so that was okay. But the world was changing, and I would suggest to you today that most of the real assets have nothing to do with factories and offices and roads or natural resources, but have to do with things like information systems, management systems, and a lot of other things which you don't even find on the balance sheet. From there, I try to put forth the notion, and there's been enormous work done in this area by James Coleman in Chicago and others, of social capital. And I would suggest to you today that social capital is the primary issue that you should be focusing on as you think about why other countries outside the United States don't have market systems of finance, and why primarily they are a relationship private financial system which has inhibited their growth, and why the United States has been so unique compared to other countries. And I would suggest to you that Europe would be the next real opportunity here because of certain elements of social capital. So what is social capital? Some people think of it as schools, some infrastructure, relationships, religious institutions. It is all of those things, hospitals. But the other thing it is are things such as rule of law, transparency, private property rights. And it's no surprise today that I believe almost half of the oil wells ever drilled on the planet have occurred in the United States due to the fact that people actually believe and have reason for it that if they do find natural resources, that they own it. Most of the other countries, if you found something, doesn't necessarily mean it belongs to you. And so private property rights has long been an opportunity in our country. Next, the HC stands for human capital, which makes up the majority of the assets in our country. And my belief was the reason why you finance businesses was organizations is who's running it, and the strength of governments is a function of where the management is. Argentina, as most of you know, one time was one of the richest countries in the world. They had a management team that came in that made it one of the poorest countries in the world not too many years thereafter. And lastly, financial technology has a multiplier effect on all these assets. If it's in place, it allows these things to free up and and therefore prosperity expands at a faster rate. What do we talk about when we talk about financial technology? Most of you are involved in those areas. Collateralized loan obligations, bonds, quote, junk bonds, high-yield bonds, since 99% of all companies are non-investment grade. Any securitization of debt falls in that category. Mortgages, credit cards, and I believe in the future in our country we'll see a tremendous securitization of small business investments, both equity and debt. There are 2 million companies in the United States, 2 million, headed by African Americans, Hispanic Latinos, and Asian Americans, do $200 billion in business. Obviously, with an average of $100,000 in annual revenue, it's pretty hard to finance those businesses individually. But the ability to find mechanisms to provide capital to those businesses will fuel the growth of our job formation in the next century. When you look at the world, and there's a little picture of the world in case you didn't remember what it looked like, and I put it there somewhat humorously, but that picture of what the world was quite different 500-600 years ago. If you asked people to draw a picture of the world, they wouldn't have drawn a picture that looks like that. And actually required us to go to outer space and take pictures back of the Earth to recognize how small and unique and how interdependent this planet is. Well, natural resources dominated valuations, and I'm sure all of you remember how Portugal and Spain, and their building their ships, and what had occurred by the ability to acquire natural resources, particularly gold and silver and their explorations and other spices, increased the wealth of those nations and created great value and great wealth, and particularly in the 15th and 16th century. But financial resources in the Industrial Revolution and the stock exchange in Amsterdam and London and Italy's financing of Northern Europe created a situation where financial resources became more important than natural resources during the Industrial Revolution. And then in this century we moved to a dominance by human and social resources rather than natural and financial resources. And I put a little slide in here called Cost of Raw Materials. In 1917, the largest company in the world was U.S. Steel. They were 3 times as large as any other business. They made more money than almost any other industry outside of steel combined, all the companies in those industries. And in fact, when you look at automobiles in 1920, 60% of the cost wasn't just raw materials and energy, and that's one of the reasons why steel was so important. By the 1990s, if we define the microchip as one of the drivers of the world economy, you see that only 2% of the cost of that product is found in raw materials and energy. So if you were financing business in the 20th century, there was a period of time that you'd want your clients to be steel companies, heavy industry, and then basically utilities. But with 2% of the cost of that product tied up in energy and raw materials, the value drivers are no longer in those businesses. The next slide I've shown you there just gives you a look if you felt that we had moved into this human and social resource environment. In 1958, a little more than 40 years ago, the 5 largest energy companies had a market value of $28 billion. So they were larger than the steel industry, the technology industry, and the pharmaceutical industry combined. Today they have a value of $352 billion. A lot of consolidation, so those 5 largest today were equivalent to about the largest 15 to 20 back in 1958. But adjusted for inflation, you would see that that isn't a huge rate of growth. The steel industry has actually shrunk. So what goes on in steel, and if you go back in history and study the strikes and how important it was and what was going on in steel to our economy today, I'm sure most of you don't wake up in the morning and wonder what's going on in the steel industry today. Likewise, technology, and the 5 largest companies went from a $9 billion to about a $1.1 trillion value. And so that industry has driven the last 40 years. And the pharmaceutical industry, the 5 largest, have gone up more than 100-fold. So or if you had seen the world and said, well, healthcare, technology, human resources, and invested in those areas, obviously they provided enormous opportunities in the latter part of the 20th century. A point I'd want to make to you here is, if you, however, had bought the 25 leading technology companies 30 years ago, and Merrill Lynch put out a great report in late 1967, and the stock prices of the leading technology companies look very similar to the internet companies today. If your stock didn't go straight up, you had poor performance. In fact, one of the more popular books that I don't know if anyone here has on their bookshelf put out in that period of time was Happiness is a Stock That Doubles in a Year. Now, and the author went on to point out why it was very easy to identify those stocks that doubled in a year. In fact, if you bought the American Stock Exchange, 10 to 20% of all the stocks doubled every year. And the American Stock Exchange, as you all know, has had dynamic growth since the 1960s. So the ability to understand that there was not one company that was one of the 50 largest companies in the United States, 0% of the revenue of the largest companies in the United States in the 1950s came from healthcare. Now, if you would perceive that our population was going to get older, this might be a growing trend, investment in the sector, today you have 20 out of the 20 largest companies actually in the entire world, 7 are in healthcare today. So the ability to be able to identify an industry is important. However, in the technology area, only one of those 25 technology companies in 1967 is still a dominant factor in that industry today. So if you pick the right industry, which has grown 100-fold in the next 30 years, it didn't necessarily mean you were successful, because you had to also figure out what were the companies of the future, and the companies that were there first weren't necessarily the companies that survived. The next one is I give you a quick look at the balance sheet of the United States. If you talk to the Federal Reserve, they'll tell you the balance sheet looks like, at the end of last year, $40 trillion. And as we all know, there's more invested in stocks now in the latter part of the 90s for the first time since the latter part of the 60s than there was in real estate. Real estate was the largest investment of individuals from the period of the late 60s through the late 1990s, but we're back where we were in the 1960s. The next page gives you a re-look at that balance sheet. And this balance sheet uses the numbers that Gary Becker, Nobel Prize winner of Chicago and Human Capital, focuses on, where he has conservatively estimated that each individual's productivity and discounted value in the United States is about $500,000. In drawing the balance sheet of the United States, all those financial assets only make up about 22% of the real balance sheet, and 78% of the balance sheet of our country lies in our people. And I want to suggest when you think about this, at the other extreme, Kevin Murphy has done some recent work based on insurance rates, which would value the average human life, discounting value, productivity, multiplier effect, at closer to $5 million, which would increase it tenfold, which would take the financial assets down to equivalent to about 2% of the assets of a country. When you reflect on the million-plus people, highly educated scientists that have left the Soviet Union in this decade, and realize, when you start thinking about the tens of billions in volatility in their debt, how small it is in comparison to over $1 trillion in human capital by any measurement that has moved out of the country in the last decade. I put on one of my little favorite slides here to show you what's not on the balance sheet in any company except for professional sports. In professional sports, you put your players on the balance sheet, you put their contracts on the balance sheet. Most of your firms don't have your contract on their balance sheet. But I put 2 teams here that you might be able to read. One on the right was the most successful professional sports franchise in history, the Boston Celtics. They had won 9 World Championships out of 10 years, but they had fallen on very difficult times. They're one of the worst teams by 1979. They only won 29 games and lost 53. And Then they were able to hire one new piece of human capital. His name was Larry Bird. He came out of Indiana State. And lo and behold, adding one player to the team, this year they won 61 games and lost 21. It was very easy to see the increase in value, and you would have had to reevaluate the stock of that company for one player's contract who went on. And they won 3 World Championships, and he was most valuable player. And last year, as the coach of the Indiana Pacers, he went to 7 games against Chicago, and who knows, if the Knicks are nice, maybe they'll even win it this year. Also, you might notice that since Larry Bird retired, the Boston Celtics have once again returned to one of the worst basketball teams. One individual, one team. I think you could each identify that as you try to figure out who you're trying to recruit to be the mayor of your city, the governor of your state, some other political office, run a company or join a company. The other perception issue on the left side, by the way, was another young man named Michael Jordan. The Chicago Bulls drew about 260,000 people a year. In 1984, they charged $15 a ticket. They drafted this young man, Michael Jordan. He was not the first pick, by the way, in the draft that year. And the next year, attendance approximately doubled, and in the year again it increased, and the management discovered they could double the ticket prices. The average ticket price doubled, and they went to capacity and stayed at capacity for almost the next decade. So, and the fortunes of that company also increased. And we've noticed this year that when that one player decided to retire and go into another career, that the fortunes of that company have decreased substantially. So we have a perception of businesses that have continuity, and I would suggest to you that part of that continuity is heavily found in the individuals that don't appear on the balance sheets. When we were young, and I was very young, we learned to memorize every state, if you lived in the United States, where every country is, and the population. And I remember when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I was always quite surprised when my parents' friends would come over to our house. It was dangerous because when you came to my house, you had a chance to be asked 1,000 questions by me. But I was quite surprised they didn't know every capital of every state, every country in Africa. I doubt if all of us could tell what names are of all the countries in Africa today. But we study those world maps, and I remember when I was in 5th grade, one of my favorite games was, could you name a river, a mountain, a city, and you turn around, and who could identify where it is on the map the fastest? So our picture of the world was generally square miles. And the Soviet Union looked very big, by far much larger than any other country. And then we learned about population, but no maps were drawn. No maps were drawn on GDP, per capita income, and so our perception of the strength of countries or the world was quite distorted as kids. So what I did here is I put a picture of what the U.S. looks like compared to Russia today on the world map that every young child is studying. And Russia is still by far the largest country in the world. 11 time zones it passes through, still today, even though it's substantially smaller than it was as the Soviet Union. But when you look at Russia economically today, it's the size of Maryland and New Jersey. So if we may be better focused on the economic power of the country and figured out how we're going to be competing with New Jersey and Maryland versus the whole United States, maybe we would have thought of different strategies earlier in competition, and it's quite possibly the concept of seeing how much they could afford to spend with the size of their business. If you think of other companies, some companies maybe didn't have enough capital to invest as much as we did, and obviously at the end couldn't meet the needs of their own citizens. The next map redraws the GDP of the world for you, showing you by continent. And you see particularly the largest increase relative to the way it looks on the map is Europe, which has a fairly small landmass area but makes up 34% of the world's GDP. And I think one of the great opportunities here, if financial technology that we have available in the United States comes to Europe, the realization today that it is already 10 to 15% larger than the United States combined as an economy without access to financial technology, what the potential is for growth there if someone brings it and it's endorsed. I'd like to point out to you two things here that you can see Africa and South America shrink substantially as to what they look like on a map. And I particularly myself have been very active in Latin America. But the projections for Latin America and Africa is today they only make up 6% of the world's economy. And if you look at it, almost any projection 30 years from now, they're actually projected to shrink as a percentage of the world's economy. So whether they stay at 6 or go to 5 combined. So when we're talking about opportunities on a relative basis, Europe and Asia are far larger and will continue to be far larger than Latin America or Africa. The next thing we have in our perception is we think everything is homogeneous. Last couple of years when we talked about problems in Asia, everyone said, well, Asian problem, Asian problem. And I'm giving you just a look here at Korea and Indonesia, which have almost nothing to do with one another. And in fact, the distance from Jakarta to Seoul is about equivalent to the distance from New York to Europe. And so saying these are the same, they're in Asia, they have similar problems. As you can see here, just for example, Korea has 3 people per phone. Indonesia has 110 per phone. Percentage of pipe water, only 13% of the people in Indonesia have pipe water. And percentage urbanization, per capita income, a factor of more than 10 to 1. So the opportunities in Korea, the level of development of human capital in Korea, the educational system in Korea, the access to technology and understanding in Korea, to look at Indonesia and Korea as the same was quite different. And some of you might remember, same thing occurred in Latin America in the 1980s. To assume that Bolivia and Peru were the same as Argentina was as naive as thinking Indonesia and Korea were the same. And that's one of the advantages when you don't travel and don't see anything. You can assume if it's in that part of the world on the map that they're the same, but it's an enormous disadvantage when you try to figure out how to build something or invest. Homogeneous, heterogeneous, we put in, you can see region A, B here. If we had a slide operation with technology, but we have to move the museum a little farther along, we could play a game here and make you think that this is Asia. And this purpose was to tell you this wasn't Asia, this was just Mississippi and New Jersey. So when you think that there's an idea, you look at test scores for the United States or what's going on, Mississippi and New Jersey have very little to do with one another. How you would govern, how you would lead, how you would build, what you would do in Mississippi is quite different to what you would do in New Jersey. So this feeling of things being similar because they're in the same part of the world or even the same part or in the same country is another thing which causes, in my opinion, misinterpretation and missed opportunities by looking at a map. The next thing I put up there was just a look, and once again with the caveat that it varies substantially, it's just what are the 8th grade algebra scores in different countries and how they compare. And the point I want to make here is just how unusual the United States has been in the last 30, 40 years versus other countries. It is not a great difference in our educational system in K through 12 that has created the difference between the United States and the rest of the world. And so this human capital that exists and the rest of the world has really never had a chance to be fully utilized due to the lack of financial technology and other factors. The next slide really addresses a unique situation, and that is secondary education in the United States, college level. And we have more teachers, for example, in the United States than Germany has college students. In fact, in the beginning of the 1990s, there were more teachers in college in the United States than college students in China. China has been slowly ratcheting up and now has picked that pace up. But we have more teachers than all those other countries combined. And we also have the world's largest standing army college students in the United States. And I would suggest to you that there's enormous opportunities in the next century. You can think back in your own life, but we've done a number of studies, particularly at the Milken Family Foundation in the last 20 years, and they keep showing the same thing. If you ask, when does a person have the most free time in their life prior to 70, it's when they're in college. every study, and then a lot of people tell you where they work. There's 20 hours a day unaccountable, 20 hours a day probably for some. That might have been me in college. But 20 hours a week, totally unaccountable. After Nintendo, after working, after studying, after 10 to 15 hours of drinking beer and just socializing and energizing, there's always this missing 20 hours. Now, 20 hours, let's say we knock out 5 million of those students that are really 30 years old. So 10 million times 20 is 200 million a week. Let's multiply that only by 35. 200 million times 35 gives us a lot of hours. We can actually give those kids a chance to see the country that exists outside school. We can actually interact with the new majority in our country. And there's enormous opportunity that could be done both for our country, increasing productivity and education for that group. The next one shows one of the reasons why we set up the Milton Family Foundation 20 years ago or so, and that was this disparity in income. And I would like to just identify this for you today as one of the two major challenges the United States faces in the next 30 to 40 years. Since 1970s, there's a huge gap widening between those people with high school educations, no high school education degree, and college degrees. And in fact, as that little slime cartoon shows you, if you were a 30-year-old male and you have a high school diploma, your income, your salary, has actually dropped in real terms by 25% in the last 25 years. You are actually making 25% less today. And this involves 70% of the population of the United States than you were 25 years ago. So if we go to the next page, you say, well, where's the revolution? There were not a lot of pickets today in Greenwich as you were driving around. You went to the train, you didn't see them picketing. They're not down there on Wall Street. They're not marching around Manhattan. Where are those? Where is that 70% of the population who's making 25% less money today? And I would say to you, the reason we don't see them today is three primary reasons. First, you can see in the chart, is the stock market. The stock market, not counting dividends, between 1965 and 1983, went up 1% per year. 1% for 18 years. So if you were born, if you were in the financial business at that time, investing in stocks was not a good part of the business to be in. And then a substantially higher rate of return if you invested in debt securities. And if you throw in dividends, you're somewhere between 3 and 4%. Now, this is not an unusual period of time. If you were lucky enough to inherit a mutual fund, which didn't really exist at the time, in the latter part of the 19th century, 40 years later, you had zero rate of return for 40 years in stocks in this country. So, little to no rate of return on equities for periods of time, in that case 40 years, in this case 18 years, is not unique in the United States history. And the period of time from 83 on has resulted, when you put in dividends, at 17 to 18%, and if we look at wider measurements, S&P, closer to 20%. So the wealth effect, the entire stock market after 200 years was worth $1 trillion in 1983. And broadly defined equities are probably somewhere between 15 trillion plus or minus today. So an increase in value of $14 trillion, the wealth effect, has trickled down to that 70% through the 401k plans, and as we read in the papers today, everyone who is a farmer, and when they're not farming, they're day trading. And of course, that's a very profitable business. You buy in the morning, you sell at night, and you double your money every day. So the wealth effect, also those fixed income investors have had a benefit from the next one, interest rates going down. So the value of fixed income securities has also gone up $3 or $4 trillion in this period of time. So you've had almost a $20 trillion increase in wealth from appreciation and a compound rate of return. Next, interest rates have gone down. That's the second major factor. And we gave you a look there in an automobile. If you wanted to buy a $10,000 car in 1980, The 3-year loan, which is what you could get then, cost you $544 a month. Today, you can buy a $25,000 car. You can get a 5-year loan easily, and it costs you some $400 plus a month. So cars, houses, refrigerators, capital expenditures for the 70% of the population we're addressing in the United States have gone down in cost because interest rates have gone down. And the third reason is multiple wage earners in a household. More women are working, 2 guys living together, 2 women living together, 3 women, 2 guys, any combination. But the cost of rent has dropped considerably in this country. And so today, for most companies, I know when we moved almost 1,000 people from the Northeast to the West Coast, one of the central issues was what did housing cost. Today, for many families, sending one child to private school after-tax cost exceeds the cost of housing. So it's education that's the issue more and more, not housing. And so these 3 factors have masked the loss of income to the majority of our population. And they are, 1, substantial increases in equity markets, and we could argue whether they can continue to grow at these rates. 2, substantial drop in interest rates, and I don't think there's any argument. It's hard for interest rates to drop another 13% because I don't think they're going to -6. And next, it's impossible for the number of people in the living unit, number of people working, to increase as dramatically as it has in the next 30 years because you'd be at 120%. So at some point in time, when these issues reverse, slow down, the majority of the people in the United States will be focused on what is their income and the fact that it would be very difficult to have a middle-class life on their salaries. Now, when you consider that there's 1.5 billion people in the world who earn less than $1 a day, it's almost impossible to afford substantial increases in compensation to the 70% of our population when many of these skills can be met in other countries, particularly developing countries. And this is the argument which I would put forth why there's such a tremendous opportunity for re-education, constant training to increase the skill set, or I would suggest we'll have a substantial reevaluation of our tax code and a transfer of wealth to the 70% in a democracy. How could you transfer that wealth? What are the things that could occur in the next 20 to 30 years? We could take the percentage of assets in charitable foundations and make it, instead of giving 5% away a year, you have to give away 10. Or instead of giving 10, you have to give away 15% a year. When my brother and I set up our foundations, there was $25 billion in the United States in private foundations. Today it's $250 billion, on its way to $1 trillion. At 5%, within 20 years, you're talking about giving away a minimum of $50 billion a year from private foundations, which is 10 times the GDP of the Palestinians, for example. What about the next century? And just touching very briefly, democratization of capital. I just want to take you back to what the world was really like, and the defining period in our country's history, in my opinion, would have been 1974. It brought to an end a period when our country was financed by banks, dependent on a few financial institutions, and this period brought to an end for a number of reasons. One, the major financial institutions were in serious financial difficulty themselves, and they essentially had to make the decision either to save themselves or to continue to service their clients, and they made the decision to save themselves. And so what did that mean? That meant that they no longer loaned money to growing businesses. They had to reduce their balance sheets. And there was a number of things that put them in this condition in 1974. It was also a period of time when the stock market went down 50%, in a little over 12 months. Many of you might not have been investing at that time. Short-term interest rates doubled in 6 months, and long-term interest rates went to 12%. I remember in 1974, triple-B bonds that were selling at 100 cents on the dollar that year. Many people think there was volatility. Traded as low as 9 cents on the dollar in December of the same year. And you could buy bonds still paying interest for their coupon. New York City was considered falling into the ocean. Its debt was trading between 20 and 30 cents on the dollar, as was the state of New York. And Con Ed bonds that used to be rated AAA, they had suspended the rating on as they went to 20 to 30 cents on the dollar. So investing in investment-grade debt proved to be a failure. And lastly, growth stock investing, Nifty 50. Many of these stocks went down 60, 70, 80%, and so the belief in giving money to large trust departments that would compound away was lost. And so this set the stage for what I would say the modern capital markets. Essentially, you're going to go to public markets, securitization. People running businesses were not going to be dependent on one particular financial institution, and so the health of their company would no longer be dependent on the health of the financial institution that financed them. And so in 1977, as the market came back, you began this enormous movement away from financial institutions that dominated access to capital to thousands. Now, one of the beneficiaries of this, if you said, where could you look, were mutual funds. And in the latter part of just less than 20 years ago, mutual funds were approximately 2% of bank assets. Banks were 40 to 50 times larger than the total amount of mutual funds. The total assets in mutual funds was $40 to $50 billion. That's equivalent to one fund today. By the end of this year, it's estimated that mutual funds might have as much as 50% more assets than banks. So you've had a switch here of 60 to 1, 70 to 1 in 20 years. Obviously, those of you who invested in money management companies have benefited. It was estimated, and I don't know if it's going to be true or not, that there will be more mutual funds than stocks listed on the New York Stock Exchange by the end of this year. Thousands of institutions with capital, with their own preferences to invest, who are looking for performances, the democratization of financial assets, which leads to democratization of industrial assets. The next chart just shows you the difference between the United States and some other countries. And just looking at the public and private debt markets versus bank assets, you can see in Indonesia that the bank assets were more than four and a half times anything in the public marketplace. So most of the other countries in the world have been dominated by few financial institutions who provide capital to few industrial institutions. The next chart I just put on there just shows you the dramatic drop in the United States through the democratization of financial assets, and shows the 200 firms percentage of the stock market. It's gone up here. You can see a little bit in the latter part of the 90s through consolidation, but also the enormous growth in companies like Microsoft and Intel, etc. We're talking about 200 companies. As a comparison, you can see where the U.S. ranks the 25 largest companies as a percentage of the marketplace. To give you a comparison, in Switzerland today, the 5 largest companies in Switzerland make up somewhere between 85 and 90% of the entire market value of the Swiss stock market. And so concentration of financial assets has led to concentration of industrial assets. And that leads to the next chart I put there, was creation of jobs. Large companies throughout this century and the previous century have always replaced people with capital. It doesn't mean you're downsizing. GE today has far fewer workers than it did 20 years ago, even though the value of the company has increased almost 15-fold in the size. So as you get larger, you discover the capital is cheaper than human capital, and you replace it. So in the United States, if you reflect over the last 30 years, 53 million new jobs. There was 200 million people living in the United States in 1970. In the next 30 years, 53 million new jobs were created, in spite of minus jobs created by investment-grade companies and Fortune 500. So more than 100% of all job creation, and this is nothing new, is created by non-investment-grade companies. It requires a democratization of financial institutions for that to occur, or not relationship-based. And let's go take a look at Europe, for example. Europe's population in 1970 was 400 million, twice the United States. The little to no job creation in Europe compared to the United States in the last 30 years. In fact, had someone stood up and told you in 1969 that in the next 30 years in continental Europe there would be almost no job creation, and asked you, that was a given fact, you could look at the newspaper and see it. What were the reasons? My guess is a lot of people would have written down another world war, some disease, some famine, etc. But I would suggest to you one of the reasons is a concentration of financial assets in few hands. As you know, in Germany today, the three largest financial institutions probably have close to $2 trillion in assets and a substantial ownership of the industrial companies. So therefore, it's only natural to expect a concentration, and in Germany, the top 25 companies make up well over 60% of the German stock market. The next thing I just want to point out, and I'll try to speed up a little here, is that there are really two different worlds out there that are occurring. There's a developed world and there is a developing world. The developed world is totally different from the developing world. And the same thing as you understand credit and ask yourself who is strong and who is weak. Many people thought that because you paid a dividend for 100 years going back, i.e. Singer, that you were strong, even though if you look forward, you might be thinking that most women might not be selling going forward in their home. And so as we look forward, we have to take a look at what is the developed world. Italy and Spain already have more people over 65 than under 14. Another reason for Europe's lack of job creation is that only 40 million in the last 30 years, 10% increase, and it's projected to actually decrease in population. So the population is decreasing, and the number of people over 65 is dramatically increasing. The number of people under 14 is very low. Developed worlds are dependent, and the dependents are over 60, over 65, not young children. In fact, the United States is projected in the year 2010 to have more people over 65 than under 14. If you look at the developing world, you'll discover it is a totally different picture. In fact, in some countries, more than 50% of the population is under 14. So what they are, what the demands are, what their labor forces are, what their workforces are, what are the needs of those societies and can grow are totally different. The other factor is the developed world, and particularly Europe, has trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities, pensions, Social Security payments. When Social Security began, life expectancy in the United States was 8 years less than when Social Security kicked in. So there wasn't a lot of risk for a lot of payments because the average person died before he got on Social Security. And in fact, when Social Security went into effect, the average was only 9 months that you were on Social Security. Likewise, there were 16 people working for every one that was retired. Now today we're down to, in our country, approaching 4 working for every one retired, and life expectancy has increased dramatically. The same issue is even more exaggerated in Europe. So what's not on the balance sheet, many of us think that it's just assets that aren't on the balance sheet, but quite often we find there's liabilities that aren't on the balance sheet. You might remember that General Motors in 89 and 90 announced that they just had $60 billion in liabilities that weren't on the balance sheet, their health care benefits and unfunded pensions. And so the concept of accounting that every number is accurate, is that right? Is that number right? Yes, our cash is within $100, and we've discounted and written down and depreciated our plants, and we're there within a million or two, and give or take $60 billion, that's either on or off the balance sheet. So what I'd suggest to you today is collectively there's trillions of dollars potentially not on the balance sheet. It's also interesting that in many countries, you find the people that are the largest money managers have the worst performance. This has something to do with measurement and transparency. No one's really ever told people what the rate of return is. When you went to business school, many people learned a number of things. You learned there were 3 Nobel Nobel Prize winners that told you the capital structure didn't matter. Then you went to work in the real world and you found that was it. Capital structure mattered. It made a difference whether you survived or didn't survive. But that is hedged because these studies are not in the real world. They assume no taxes and a number of other factors. The other real world we have today is that it's not hard. It doesn't take a lot to see what the average age of the population is, how many children there are, and then project. It's hard to find 35-year-olds in 20 years who don't currently exist. We have not figured out how to go from 0 to 35 in 20 years yet. Next, I put on a little chart here because in the United States we sometimes forget where we came from. Today's world, we have a lot of people fighting over territory, having discussions, etc. So we put a little map here just telling you where the United States came from, and there were some acquisitions that were really attacked at the time. The Louisiana Purchase, 2 cents an acre, was considered one of the worst investments of all time, as was Alaska. Seward's Folly, also 2 cents an acre. But a more interesting chart, I think, when we want to think about the future is where did the U.S. come from chart. And that chart shows that England, what England contributed to the United States, and we could argue whether it was willingly or not, what they contributed has a GDP of $5.1 trillion. That would make it the largest country in the world, just what came from England. Now, we would also argue, I think, that if it was still part of England, it might not be doing $5.1 trillion. But the one I want to point out to you particularly is what came from Mexico. And the southern part, southwestern part of the United States has a GDP of $2.1 trillion. That, combined with Mexico, would be the third largest economic force in the world. And I would say to you that many of the parts of the United States that came from Mexico look far more like Mexico than they do the United States. 70% of the children in public school in Los Angeles today, native language is Spanish. So, as you think about the next 20 to 30 years, I would suggest you can never underestimate the relationship between Mexico and the United States and the increasing ties and the increasing opportunities for Mexico and the United States and the increasing interdependence. If you look at the next chart, you'll see Mexico doubled its population in the last 30 years. They went from 50 million to 102 million people in spite of the fact that a lot of people from Mexico came to the United States. As a comparison, Mexico added more people in the last 30 years than Europe, even though Europe's population was almost 8 times Mexico. 50 million, 50% of the population of Mexico is under 20 years old. They haven't begun to have children, and so the potential multiplier effect, and if the opportunities aren't in Mexico, they will be here. Brazil and Mexico by 2030 will be larger in population than the United States. I just want to once again point out to you that by all estimates, without massive immigration, Europe is projecting a decrease in population in the next 30 years, coupled at the same time with a massive aging of their population. Italy, for example, is projected the population is going to go from 52 million to 38 million in this period of time. I would suggest to you that that will be wrong, because most of the people in Romania and Albania might decide they like Venice and Florence better. But what we think of as Italy and the ancestors of Italy and what Italy is will be totally changed. I went back to Berkeley for a 30-year reunion a few years ago, 83 of us. We went back to relive our times. I had arranged things. We had studied the Daily Californian from 1964 to 66. We had arranged an all-night card party, and by 2 o'clock there's only 6 of us still up. But we went to visit our fraternity, and they were singing the same songs and doing everything the same, but the fraternity was 65% Asian American. And so It was the same fraternity, but their ancestors and the ethnic mix had changed substantially. UC Irvine today is 70%, this is Orange County, 70% Asian Hispanic. So what these countries are will not only change, but they will change dramatically. Now let's talk about what we already know about in the 21st century that we might not be thinking about today. First thing I would suggest to you is that Europe is going to have a movement towards financial technology. This should spur growth and competition and present many opportunities, and if the Euro experiment does work, the U.S. will be facing substantially more competition as young businesses get started. 60% of all the debt in the United States is non-investment grade in the public marketplace now versus 17% in Europe. There are more than 1,000 companies in Europe doing over $1 billion in annual revenue who have never tapped the public marketplace today. So this is very similar to what the United States was 20 to 25 years ago. The mutual fund industry, the money management industry, people focused on transparency and rates of return will create enormous opportunities here for young, growing businesses and access to capital, which I think will definitely quicken the pace if the governments allow it to occur. The next slide I just threw in there was showing you information processing as a percentage of capital expenditures. This is an entire different world we live in. You know that. If you have technology changing every 2 years, it causes constant retraining, education. They're now estimating 8 jobs in a person's career. Therefore, just sitting in a job wouldn't make a difference. There's a picture of my parents. I wish I could have known them then, but I wasn't around. But I wanted to show you what has happened in education. It's the second largest industry in the United States. When my father went to the University of Wisconsin in 1935, he sold his Bulova watch to pay for his education. Andy Tisch and the guys at Lowe's obviously haven't been able to keep the price on Bulova watches marching up with the cost of education today. But 1 year for a resident only cost $55 in 1935. If we adjust that to current dollars, it's $654 versus a cost today for a resident of Wisconsin of $3,400. So the cost of education has increased 5 to 6 times the level of inflation in the last 60 years. Yet education is still the best investment. When I went to Berkeley, for an in-state student, it cost $200 for tuition. In today's current dollars, that'd be $1,000. And the cost for a student today is $4,000. So Berkeley has increased 4 times the level of inflation. So it's hard to say that people at Berkeley don't understand economics. Now, Wharton, on the other hand, has only increased about twofold versus inflation at $25,000. So my guess is there's a lot of room to raise that price again. And then I just wanted to show you the University of Phoenix. When we say that technology has meant something today in education, if you went online and wanted to get your bachelor's degree from the University of Phoenix, it would cost you $64,000, $16,000 a year if you went 4 years to get a degree by taking all the courses. Now compare that to the financial service industry, where the cost of moving from a teller to electronics has dropped the cost of transaction processing by 99%, whereas our cost of education has increased dramatically. When you look at lifelong learning, you can see we've defined in the United States alone as about a $900 billion business. You could not define 1 or 2 or 3 companies that you think are dominant leaders. This is a highly fractured market, very similar to what healthcare was 40 years ago. The next slide, which I see is too small to read, gets you a look at Knowledge Universe and how we've broken it down, but you can get your magnifying glass out later and take a look at it. I put one slide in here just to show you what is going to change in knowledge and education. Today, the modem, which takes 46 minutes to download a 3.5-minute video, it really gets you fired up in a teaching environment, where it takes 10 times to 12 times as long to download as it does to show. But when that moves to 8 seconds, and you have 100 and 350th, when you're about to reduce it, where you can now download 3.5 minutes, so we have a ratio here of 25 to 1. It only takes 4% of the time downloading versus showing it. The ability to put things on is going to change dramatically, and the opportunity to bring technology to the individual and individualized learning throughout their lifetime is just a few years away. Now, we talked about the fact in healthcare that you did not have any companies 40 years ago among the top 50. Yet this only makes up projected 15 to 16% of our economy. So my point I'm trying to make here, if you define the problems of society and what are the needs of society and invest in those sectors and identify and build in those sectors, you will be well rewarded. And likewise, if you are invested in the sectors of society that were yesterday's interest, i.e. steel, not only will you decline, but the businesses you're in are questionable whether they remain to be viable. I wanted to put healthcare on here for a number of reasons. One, it's where I spend most of my time. But two, I believe the 21st century is the century of biology, whereas the 20th century was the century of physics. Today, cancer is a major issue in our country. I just wanted to show you that there was actually a president that did declare a war on a disease. Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared a war on polio. The peak number of cases in the United States, and my father did have polio as a boy, was 52,000 cases. And the most number of people that died in any one year in the United States from polio was 1,200. And in the 1950s, they were projecting the cost of polio in the United States would exceed $100 billion a year by the year 2000. Well, the Salk vaccine came in 55, and when Elvis Presley got the vaccine in 56, we all knew it was safe for all of us to go take. And today the cost is non-existent. There was 5,000 cases of polio on the planet last year, almost all of which were in Central Africa, where their primary interest was in getting inoculations. In fact, in India in 1997-98, an equivalent of one day, half a day in each year, more than 100 million children were given the polio vaccine. Now, some of us think you can't reduce health care, and I noticed one of our guests today was involved, but this company, Medco, was started in 1983. And it really began when I was sitting at my trading desk and I had a call from Lee Iacocca telling me that we had a big problem. So I wanted to understand what our big problem was, and he told me he just discovered that there was more cost for pharmaceutical care for retired workers in automobile than steel. He couldn't do anything about that cost. It was a big problem. So I asked him, why was it my problem? And he reminded me that we were the second largest creditor of Chrysler at the time, so any of his problems were my problems. Well, I was very lucky that day. Marty Wygott was visiting, and he had successfully, and we had financed him in the building of two medical companies, Glassrock and Porex Prior, and within a month gave birth to a company called Medco. Its basic idea was a mail-order pharmacy, taking care of your pharmaceutical needs, shipping generic products across state line. We thought it was a great idea. However, Merck did not think it was a great idea. Merck suggested, here's what we should do. We should go to a local pharmacy, buy the product, ship it to Ohio, and then ship it back to our customers at half of what we paid the local pharmacy. We told them we didn't think that was a business model that people wanted to finance. But eventually Merck came around, and they bought Medco for $6.6 billion 10 years later, which is worth about $20 billion today in Merck stock. And Medco at the time was either managing, underwriting, delivering 17% of all the prescriptions in the United States, and reduced health care costs substantially. So when we talk about not being able to reduce health care costs, I believe we're about to see a dramatic decrease in some of these costs. Cancer today, I just wanted to show you a comparison to polio. 1 in 2 men will get cancer in the United States. 1 in 3 women. Prostate cancer is the most diagnosed cancer, 1 in 5 men. And one of the things that I've worked on very hard in the last 5 or 6 years particularly is that there might be some relationship between what we eat and cancer. I put in a little chimpanzee here. There are 150,000 edible plant species. Chimpanzees eat 3,000 types. We eat 150, we being all human beings combined. And the average American generally gets most of it from 6 to 8. The question of who's the dependent and who is the independent, half of all pharmaceutical products come from plants, and 60% of all the remaining plants on the planet are in the tropics. So these tropical rainforests hold, we don't know, a lot of assets, maybe far more valuable than any internet company. The 21st century, I just listed some of the things that people are focused on, and I have a little picture there which is hard to see, but that is minimally invasive heart bypass surgery. It's estimated to be 10,000 of them in the United States this year. From going in to being back at work is 7 days. A few days in the hospital. If we went to 100% of this technique, we'd eliminate maybe as much as 2 million hospital days. They do not break your rib cage, and it's just a 2.5-inch scar. And it looks like a little Swiss Army knife. Also on the list, some of you might be familiar with these, are therapies that are now being tested in human beings, such as you inject a chemical, it goes to all those cells you don't like, let's say particular cancer cells. Nothing happens. You pass under a low laser, it activates those chemicals, which are only at the cells that you want to kill. And so it's a benign treatment until you pass under the laser. One of the ones I want to put on, which some of us might be interested in, is memory drugs. Now, they've been experimenting, and some of you might be working on this, with the fruit fly. Many scientists consider the fruit fly one of the dumbest animals on Earth. They found that they generally have to shock them 43 to 44 times before you get the message. So you put a piece of rotten fruit over there, the fruit fly flies over there, thinks it's good, you shock it, it goes away, then it comes back. After an average of 43 to 44 times, it stops going to that piece of fruit. So they've been working now, and they have energized their memory cells, and now after one time, they've trained the fruit flies not to go to that fruit. What they're talking about is photographic memories. There are certain downsides. If you never forget, you don't forget bad things, and you don't forget good things either. But the concept of memory, which can have a substantial effect on Alzheimer's and other things. And also, I was able to remember 3 million trades, but eventually computers took over and could bypass me. I actually did have a substantial advantage when I went to Wall Street in the late 1960s, and I could calculate bond yields in my head by going from base 10 to base 2 back to base 10. But I was quite disappointed with the invention of the calculator, about 18 months later, which negated that advantage. So let's just backtrack here. I just want to point out a couple of things to you, and then I will open it to questions if we have time. First, let's make sure we have the right frame of reference when we look. It isn't how big it is. It isn't necessarily found on a map. Second, financial technology has caused a democratization of industrial power, which has created jobs and opportunities. You need transparency, you need property rights, etc. These concepts do exist increasingly in Europe. In Asia, I think it will be far slower than people expect, and one of the reasons is that it's not necessarily clear that they want transparency. And so 15 families in most of these countries outside of China and Japan control 60-70% of the financial assets, have the political power, and have the industrial assets. And it's not necessarily a logical conclusion that they want a democratization of financial assets which allows people to compete inside their own markets. And so I believe that will take a little while. And until you have private property rights clearly defined, that some of you might invest in entirely discovered, owning debt that even when you go bankrupt, you're not allowed to foreclose for 7 years, and the person managing the business is allowed to transfer assets out of the company to his personal company, you discover that there isn't a lot of value in that debt. And even in China, if you've invested in some companies, you discover they thought they had $4 billion in debt. Now, when you get to the next balance sheet, there was $25 billion in debt, just give or take, 500%. So the concept isn't necessarily fully developed. In China, we could argue that property rights has really never been the issue. And it hasn't been the issue because the government has wanted things that they consider to be positive for the country as widely distributed as possible to everyone, and things they considered not positive, not distributed to anyone. So therefore, property rights was not high on the utility curve. And when you realize you're about to have 250 million people move from a rural area to an urban area, order in this transfer is so important for a government that we could argue that their focus of attention might be order first, wealth creation second, and democracy third. And so as you look at evolution, I'm not sure that the concept of really what it means to have shareholders' rights, property rights is fully understood or willingness to be understood in many countries. And Europe seems at the top of the list. Latin America is an interesting opportunity. I did not speak as much about it today only because of the size of the market relative to Europe. Lastly, we want to focus on the fact that there are two distinct types of countries in the world. Those with aging population. In the United States, the baby boomers will dominate the policies of this country for the next 30 to 40 years. They will be heavily related towards healthcare, which is why biotech and biology, I think, will be the science of the next century. And their needs, it is the wealthiest generation that's ever lived on the earth. It's one of the most spoiled generations that ever lived on the earth. And its needs will be to solve the problems of cancer, heart disease, and other issues. And the constituency for the under 14 group is fairly small in most developed countries as you look at 20 to 30 years. Lastly, the challenge for the United States is one where 70% of the population today, it's difficult to pay them a rate commensurate with what they need for a good middle-class life just on their salary based on job skills in a world competitive market where someone in Mexico might be getting $1 to $2 to $3 a day total wage just across the Rio Grande. So if you're in manufacturing processes, it's very difficult. The U.S. has an enormous advantage if you look at the U.S. and Mexico combined, rather than just look at one country. It evens out the age spreads. It increases substantially the percentage of the population that's young. Europe does not have this opportunity. They don't have neighbors in continental Europe unless they go to Africa that afford them this opportunity. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. No, it's definitely not 1929. 1920s, you were dominated once again by factories. Today we're talking about ideas, the power of distribution of those ideas, the percentage of the GDP that is digitized is continuing to increase. And so I don't think it's any comparison to 1929. The wealth formation of $16 to $20 trillion, there's a large percentage of our population, that 5 to 10%, that could afford 50% reduction in wealth, 80% reduction in wealth, and still never spend their wealth. So I don't believe there are any comparisons like that today. And if you're in a portfolio strategy, if you're talking about Internet, if Internet went to zero tomorrow, it's still 10% of the market. So from a portfolio standpoint, we don't have this concentration. And much of these companies have huge amounts of cash. Microsoft, Oracle, these companies do not have debt. They have cash on the books today. So liquidity is available. And I think the the web-based environment, but the ability to move things that I've outlined here at the speed to be able to move them has changed the world substantially. Moving financial technology to Europe, I think, substantially increases the growth rate of Europe. I don't pick sides. My view, my own personal view of my own treatment is anything that's reversible, I will try. So anything that has no permanent side effects, you'll engage with. Many treatments have permanent side effects. And so nutrition and diet have a substantial upside in that if you stop with that diet, you're quite often immediately reversible. The fact that our death rate is 5 to 10 times higher than other countries, the fact that when people move here within a generation, they move to our level of death rate, say from breast or prostate cancer, is easy. It's not too hard to figure out. It has nothing to do with who your family was. It's heavily related to environment. And so that's why I pushed hard on the element. To me, it was no different than trying to explain to someone that a non-investment grade security might be less risk than one that one considers to be risky. And so I think we're in, and where are we? I think we're in kind of the midpoint of discovery here. You know, we now know that some of the oils we eat actually have receptors on cancer cells. They encourage their growth. So if you want to think of them like fertilizer, you want your cancer to grow a little faster, you could just go out there and have some more of these oils, and maybe you can accelerate the growth if that was what your objective was being. Most people prefer to see that in a dish than in their body. And likewise, you can somewhat impede growth. We now have a program at Sloan Kettering where the only therapy for certain men with low-grade prostate cancer that have elected not to do anything is nutrition, and have reduced PSAs by 25% just by changing diet. So there are these facts, and I think I'd give you a comparison. The most valuable brand in the 1980s was Marlboro. It was perceived to be worth $30, $40 billion. Most valuable brand today might be Coca-Cola. It's quite possible that we will discover, some of the things that are on our popular brands aren't healthy for us. I don't know if it's Coca-Cola, McDonald's. Who knows what the issues are here? And so I think from an investor standpoint, that we just are moving along to what we know might succeed. Most of alternative medicine people viewed skeptically, yet Indian medicine, Chinese medicine might be 5,000 years old. They don't know why it works. It just works. Actually, some of you might be familiar with, I'm sure, the Syrian currency of, say, 300 BC. I don't know if any of you trade that. But the coin, the symbol on the Syrian coin was a fennel, which was a plant, which was a contraceptive. So if you ate this, it was a contraceptive. That was it. There was nothing else had to do, no side effects, etc. Unfortunately, this plant died out, and with it, part of the economy of Syria died out, and eventually the coins died out. And that's why I try to highlight the rainforest. We had a movie, Medicine Man, which some of you might have seen a number of years ago, and it's quite often how science fiction becomes real. And so I think we're just at the beginning of this stage of activity. We had a major setback in 1993 with the interpretation by the marketplace of regulated rates of return on pharmaceutical and biotech companies on their products. And so you might remember in a period of 14 months, Merck stock went down 50%. The major pharmaceutical company stocks went down $75 billion. And they, as a result, have substantially changed their strategy, even though they wouldn't articulate that. And that strategy is it was easier to buy another pharmaceutical company than develop product. And today, things that are coming off patent, if you can delay that anyway, at 90% margins, you're going to delay it. And so the thing in the marketplace today are the biotech companies that keep pushing technology in this space and developments. And we have to find a way to better get capital to this group. One of the ideas might be allowing them to sell their tax loss carryforwards. But the entire pharmaceutical, let's just take one. Merck's market value is very similar to the entire biotech industry's market value. And the biotech industry spends 5 times what Merck does in R&D. So the question is, if we're going to push R&D in this sector, like we have in the informatics and telecommunications, we need to find encouragement. And I think some of the new financial securities in this area create a lot of promise. But I think we're kind of in the midway zone, and we're starting to learn things now, and we have not gone all the way to the end. My guess is by 2001 to 2003, when we finish mapping the genome and mapping diseases, that we'll find, why all these old remedies from medicine men worked. Yes, we funded a conference a few years ago for cancer with the FAA, which for the most part has eliminated phase 3, which has cut in half the time and the cost of introducing cancer drugs. But Europe has a lot going on in Europe in this area where you can bring products to human beings much faster. And I think the pressure is coming on. The pharmaceutical industry will tell you it costs, $400 million plus for an average product in the marketplace. It might take 10 to 12 years. The public really has not demanded this responses. There are so many things we could have done. Mammograms for women, the government agencies such as the CIA and others had technology on the spy satellites that could record who's here today and what we're saying, that did not have any traces on them, which they didn't want to make available to other countries, that they could have put this technology into medicine a decade ago and had no side effects from mammograms. Well, the University of Pennsylvania just got access to it. In terms of Livermore Laboratories, their ability to measure radiation far exceeds anything available in the private sector in medicine. And it was only in the last year or so when one of the people working there's parents got cancer that they moved to try to declassify measurement and four-dimensional measurement of where radiation is going. It'll be interesting to see how this is handled, and that the results of their work have shown that where we thought when you were getting radiation, say for cancer, lung cancer, something, that you got all the tumor, that you didn't. And have we had the more accurate measurement that the other government agencies had available, maybe the treatment outcomes of individuals have been substantially different in the last decade. So this is a byproduct of the DOD, byproduct of CIA and other type of agencies, NASA, and the question is, are we going to make it available quicker to us? The budget for biological warfare in the Defense Department far exceeds the budget for anything we spend on cancer. I've been trying to put forth the last couple of years that in biological warfare, they've identified if it could kill 100,000 people, it's potentially an agent that you want to address. Well, we lose 560,000 people a year to cancer. 1 in 2 men are going to get cancer, 1 in 3 women. I felt it was large enough constituency that we could actually classify this as biological warfare. And I actually think we would have a solution in a 3 to 5 year period of time if we would decide that that was the case. We spent more on Somalia, for example, twice in 1 year we spent on all cancer research, so it's just a question of allocation of resources as to how we want to address the issue. And I think the baby boomers who are aging and are voting, as I'm sure all you know, the older you get within reason, the more you vote. 20-some-odd% of 20-year-olds vote, 30% odd of 30-year-olds vote, 40% of 40-year-olds vote, 50% of 50-year-olds, 60% of 60-year-olds. So as the baby boomers all become 50 and 60, a lot of them are going to be voting who didn't vote before, and they'll be focused on more and more medical issues. But I'm very excited about technology. If you've read about Craig Ventnor's work here, you can just see he's mapping the human genome, $300 million investment in his company. We don't know what's going to happen, but it looks like it's only going to take 4 years. The NIH's program was a 10-year program. The minute he announced that he was going to complete in 2001, they decided they could accelerate and buy a few more machines. So if it accelerates cure, I want to give you a number here. Kevin Murphy has estimated the cure of cancer and heart disease would add potentially $90 trillion in value to just the U.S. So you're talking about some fairly big numbers. We invest 2% of what we spend in care in research. So if you think of Intel, for example, Intel and R&D and capital expenditures probably puts up 15-20% of revenue. We are spending 2% in this sector, and it's very hard to understand any commercial enterprise who would spend $100 on service and $2 trying to correct the problem. Doesn't sound like a good idea, and hopefully we'll find a quick solution to that problem.
Steve, you want to give us any closing thoughts?
Thank you. I'd like to apologize to any of you whose colleagues couldn't make it here today. Bringing Mike into town created a longer waiting list than we had seats in the room, so we apologize. And I would like to thank Richard Handler for making this possible. Rich, thanks for introducing us to Mike. Rich will be launching a fund that you'll be hearing a little bit more about. I would also like to say, if you would like to see Mike's slides, you should go to Santa Monica to the Milken Institute conference, and they've got quite an impressive show. Sorry for the low tech, but this is our home. And finally, I'd like to thank Mike Milken for not only creating a revolution 15 years ago, but for teaching us how to give back. Mike is really doing some things in California that are changing the shape of that social scene and philanthropic scene. And on that note, let's not forget the Bruce Museum on June 5th at the Renaissance Ball. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Mike, you mentioned